They arrived on a wind that smelled of salt and iron, 23 souls who had walked their way out of Georgia, crossing swamps that clung to the ankles like hands, and roads that were more rumor than path. Brooklyn, in August of 1863, throbbed with the recent violence of men. The draft riots had seared Manhattan and left the city tasting of smoke and fear. Across the river, the shore at Wallabout Bay lay calmer, though its soil kept old grief. The bones of prisoners from a different war, an older cruelty. Into that fraught lull came the refugees from Pritchard's Landing, 24 almost, moving not like strangers who met on the way, but as a single weathered body trained by hardship to breathe together. They called their leader Patience. She bore the name like a blade turned inward, tall and lean, hair wrapped in a faded red cloth that remembered brighter days. She gave so little to the registry that Harold Grayson, the gentleman who funded this place in an abandoned rope factory, could not help but stare at the omissions. 7 months on the road, 31 when they left, 23 when they arrived. She said rice when asked what they had worked, but something in her mouth curled around the word as if it carried splinters. She spoke of nothing else. The children clung to the skirts and the sleeves of the grown ones and did not play. Their silence was not shyness, but knowledge. The volunteers noticed. Most people came alone or in the scattered constellations of family, drawing new orbits among other freed folk by nightfall. Not these. They slept in touching bunks and ate side by side and spoke a low-country lilt threaded with Gula's memory. Their watchfulness was not suspicion so much as accounting, a head count of breath that repeated with each dawn and dusk. And yet, on their second night, when the yard filled with the bright smoke of ground beef and the pan-sizzle of onions, something in that company loosened. The young German butcher, Friedrich Vogel, Fritz to anyone who loved him, had argued for hamburgers. A worker's dish, he said, mixing salt into the chopped meat with careful hands. He had fled Prussia after a failed promise of liberty. He knew how a warm bun could hold a man up when speeches could not. The rolls were soft, the patties crackled. Volunteers carried plates along the long trestles as the sun bled gold into Manhattan's broken skyline. The children smelled first, their eyes widened, and then, slowly as if approaching a skittish animal, the 23 gathered at the line. They came last as if to guarantee all others had enough. Patience lifted her portion as one might lift a book saved from a fire. She inhaled. Around her, Solomon, gray-bearded with hands nicked by years of work, closed his eyes in reverence. A girl, Naomi, pressed her brow against the bread as if in benediction. The infant they called Hope fussed, and then settled, sensing the hush. The first bite broke a seal. Tears arrived not singly but as a weather system, a sudden rain that cleansed and undid. They ate and wept, great shuddering sobs heaving through ribs accustomed to bracing. They wept for a seasoning that felt like recognition, for salt that did not come from sweat but from care, for the ordinary miracle of food cooked to please the tongue rather than quiet the belly. Friedrich froze with his spatula in the air, helpless, his own eyes stinging. Anna Müller, who had once boiled nettles in a Prussian winter and called it soup, cried too, and Thomas Rutherford, the free black volunteer whose parents had run north in a different decade, stood with his hands in his pockets and did not move. He knew. This was what dignity tasted like on the mouth. Long minutes later the storm passed, the plates were emptied, the last juices sopped with thumb and bread. Patience came to Friedrich and took his hand in both of hers. "We never knew food could taste like this," she said, her English careful but sure. "Like we were people who deserved it." He could not speak, only nodded. In the lamplight, a shadow detached itself from the tree line and watched the yard until the lamps dimmed. Then the shadow turned toward the ferry road, where 2 other silhouettes waited with the patience of men used to their own impunity. They lost Ruth first. She was 7 with a quiet way of moving that made grown people lean in to hear her. In the laundry yard, the lines ran from post to post like staff lines awaiting a hymn. Anna taught the children a little German song about sunshine, and the cotton shirts fluttered as if in applause. Anna left the girl for 3 minutes to fetch more pins. When she returned, the pins trembled in an empty palm. The line swayed in a wind that had not risen. The space where a child had been remained a space. They searched the latrine, the shoreline, the thin fringe of woods, the alleys between barracks. Grayson organized, called, promised, sweated. Volunteers fanned out until their voices were hoarse. Nothing. Noon came with its blank glare. Ruth had been removed from the world as neatly as a page torn at its perforation. Patience's face did not crack. When told, she stilled so completely, a moth might have landed on her sleeve and thought it bark. "Did anyone see a man?" she asked. "A white man watching?" Grayson, earnest, wounded by the suggestion, assured her that no one unauthorized had entered the premises. She thanked him as one thanks a child who has drawn a map of a city he has never walked. Then she gathered her people and spoke in the tongue of tidewater kin, and their answer was a tightening you could see, a pairing up of souls, a readiness. That night, a boy and a man stood awake by turns outside the barracks, their silhouettes and the moon taking counsel. Friedrich went to the precinct, hat in hand, grief burning respect into smoke. "Negro girl from the contraband camp," the desk sergeant said without looking up. "They run off." He would not take the report. "We do not waste men," he added, the sentence itself an erasure. Friedrich came back with humiliation on his cheeks and anger like fever. Thomas Rutherford did not bother with official desks. He slipped into the city's black churches and dockside taverns, where men kept their eyes down and their ears up. Stories crossed the bar on breath. White men who dressed like merchants but watched like hunters. Papers with seals that turned the living into inventory. The covered wagon that was a mouth you didn't come back from. On the 4th day, Caleb disappeared. He was older, limped from an old injury that had never known a doctor's hand. He walked toward the trees for privacy and did not return to the wagon he'd been unloading. His absence had the clean edges of a signature forged by an artist. By mid-September, the camp had learned a terrible rhythm as Patience's people dwindled. A body gone from the circle, the bunk left smooth, a name whispered at meals and then withheld to staunch the leak. The others began to avoid them. Sorrow and fear produced their own quarantines. Someone muttered the word curse, but curses require magic, and what worked here was law. One night, Naomi's bunk held only hope, wrapped tenderly, as if the child had been set down by a mother with clean hands and seconds to live inside a decision. Patience did not wail. She spoke to the child in a voice pared to sinew and asked Grayson for a private room. There, amid ledgers and a dented stove, she put down the truth like a ledger of her own. Pritchard's Landing was not only rice, it was breeding. Children tallied before their teeth came in, girls paired like livestock, boys measured for bone and brightness, everywhere the arithmetic of a future sold in advance. "When we left," she said, "we did not just steal ourselves, we stole contracts and profits, names, ages, values." She drew in breath. The papers held northern names. Boston, Philadelphia, Brooklyn. Her eyes flicked to his. We could not read them all. But one began with Grav, like gray turned longer. Grayson went white in the manner of a man who has mistaken the mirror for a window. He wanted to reject it as slander. But the vanishings had been surgical, who they were, where they stood, when they moved. Someone had sketched the camp from the inside. Patience did not accuse him. She accused his city. "Somebody tied to this place," she said, "is telling them where to cut." A knock came. Friedrich, uneasy. A man outside claimed to be from the Freedmen's Bureau. The bureau did not exist yet. Patience stood. "That's one of them," she said. "They'll try tonight." "I can feel it like rain," Grayson instructed Thomas to find federal muscle. The army still patrolled, and war had given uniforms a kind of moral weight. He returned to the yard to meet the visitor named Wexler and his smooth counterfeit papers. The man spoke of census and verification and fraud prevention, and Grayson, smiling a host's smile, consented to everything while thinking of keys and files, of records that could be turned into chains. The sun slid down the yard's wall like a coin. Twilight drew long blue threads through the barracks. The children had eaten early. From the east side of the compound, a knock sounded with the friendliness of a salesman. "Letter for a Miss Patience Crane," a voice called, easy as daylight. "From Georgia. Urgent family business. Silence can clot." Inside, Solomon's whisper was sharp enough to cut. "Ain't no letter." Yet the voice returned, changing its blade. "News of a girl named Ruth. Says she's alive and waiting." Hope seemed suddenly heavier in Patience's arms. She moved to the door and asked for proof. The man's face, when she saw it through the gap, tore a long seam in her calm. She knew him, not by name but by stance, the overseer's assessor's gaze that measures muscle and price. She slammed the door. He wedged his boot. The door gave. The knight stepped in. He did not come alone. Wexler was there with his tidy lies, and with him a taller figure whose silver hair framed a face practiced in certainty. He had the voice of a man who had issued orders to men who obeyed. "We can do this the easy way," he said, mid-Atlantic vowels polished like marble, "or we conduct ourselves in the manner the law allows." He produced papers like a magician produces doves, seals, signatures, warrants. "Thaddeus Pritchard claims his property," he said. "Federal authority secures it." He let the ugly word do the work. Property. Daniel laughed then, not mirth, but the bark of a tree split by lightning. "We got no legal right to be free," he said, "but you got legal right to chain us twice." He set his jaw. "You want me, you kill me." The choice was a gallows geometry. Submit and be erased, resist and be ruined. Either way, the body did not belong to itself. The men had clubs, rope, numbers, practice. They were efficient in the way of industries that have learned how to hide their accidents. The struggle was brief and brutal, but not murderous. Dead flesh cannot be resold. Patience fought with the ferocity that mothers discover when grief is still a possibility rather than a fact. Rope bit wrists, knees met ribs. Solomon's blood ran warm into his beard. The tall man did not sweat. He observed. When the last knot held, he crouched beside Patience and introduced himself with the courtesy of a man arriving at a parlor. "Lawrence Graverson," he said. "We have interests in Georgia. Your company represents a significant investment." He spoke as if offering consolation. "Nothing personal," she spat. He dabbed with a white handkerchief that had known only banquet stains. "Load them," he told his men. "Quietly." Benjamin, thin, barefoot, 10, slipped under an elbow and ran like a boy who has learned that speed can substitute for power. He ran to the main yard where Friedrich, tending the banked coals, turned at the scream. The poker in his hand became a staff. He saw the pistol. He saw the papers. He saw Patience bound and Solomon half-conscious, and his own future shrinking to a single point on the end of a barrel. He had left one tyranny. He had not agreed to bless another. He lifted the iron. Thomas Rutherford hit the door first, a wave of sweat and resolve, and behind him 4 Union soldiers with their blue-like judgment. "No one moves," Thomas said, and the world, astonished, obeyed. The lieutenant, a boy from Connecticut who had learned at Gettysburg that law and justice do not always shake hands, took it in at a glance. Guns, rope, men, fear. Graverson calculated, as he was built to do. The law might be his, but a public mess was not. He bowed thinly. "A misunderstanding," he announced to the room. "We will return with proper officers." He looked at Patience as if at a ledger not yet balanced. "This is not over," his gaze promised. "It never is." They left into a night that stretched long and thin. The soldiers cut knot after knot, their hands clumsy with gentleness. Water came. Linens came. Shame came too, for a camp that had thought itself a harbor and discovered it was a pier. By morning, the army lieutenant had taken statements and measured the thickness of the legal wall that would soon be erected around them. He could post guards for a little while. He could not stop the law if it arrived in daylight with the proper signatures. He spoke as men speak who mean well and must confess the limits of their meaning. "Contest in court," he said, and Solomon laughed that same desolate laugh. What was there to contest when ink said otherwise? Grayson and Thomas pulled at threads in the city until a net appeared. Graverson financing Pritchard's breeding with northern money, contracts that speculated on human futures as if they were cotton bales. A boarding house in 5 Points where Dutton held the newly taken until transport or something worse. The line ran from a planter's study to Wall Street offices where men sipped coffee and congratulated themselves on abolition while their dividends fattened from the South's arithmetic. But one question lay closer than all the others and stung more. How had each taking been timed to opportunity? How had they known when a girl hung laundry or an older man stepped into trees? The answer arrived with an Irish name that was not Irish. Sean O'Brien, helpful, stalwart volunteer, turned out to be Shay Toiver, a specialist in the kind of finding that money demands. He had stood at their tables and smiled while memorizing faces. He had steered work rosters to isolation and sent tidy notes to men who dressed like merchants and behaved like thieves with paperwork. Under military questioning, he insisted he had not known the rest. It is always a comfort to stand on the small island of what one has not known. That night, Grayson stood before the camp and let what remained of his dignity burn down to honesty. He confessed the infiltration, the names, the scheme, his unwitting part as host to harm. "I thought I was helping," he said, and his voice did what voices do when truth presses through the ribs. Patience rose. "You tried," she granted, but she did not absolve. "The country betrayed us long before you did. We knew, before this place, that even kindness can be turned to a weapon." She held up the memory of the hamburger like a candle. "That night, we tasted being human," she said. "No law can take that from us." The lieutenant gave them 2 days of borrowed safety. After that, paper would win. The map on the table pointed north, as if by its own will. Canada was the word the mouth made when it needed breath. But miles had teeth, and the border was more than a line. It was a gauntlet. Thomas Rutherford offered something less grand and more possible, a chain of doors that would open and close in the night, a quilt of strangers who were kin for a single meal, a single bed, a single mile. New names could be born out there and clothe the old bodies. It was not freedom as men in assemblies declare it. It was survival as practiced by people history calls fugitives and God calls by name. Grayson emptied what he could of his coffers and pride. Money turned into shoes and shawls, into food that traveled and papers that lied for righteous ends. Choices cut the air into smaller pieces. Hope, the infant, could not be hurried across counties with fever in the grasses and men with warrants in their pockets. She needed a legal name and a steady roof. Patience held her as if the world had ended at the curve of that tiny skull. She kissed the child's brow and made the oldest vow. "You will grow up free," she whispered. "You will taste good things and not be surprised by them. You will not be taught to make yourself small." Then she did the bravest thing a guardian can do. She gave the child to safety that did not include herself. They left on the 2nd of October after midnight, when the river's breath lay close to the ground, and even the rats moved more softly. Thomas went with them, erasing the line he had drawn around his life and redrawing it around theirs. Friedrich and Anna watched until even the idea of them had faded into the dark. In the morning, the yard looked the same to a stranger. Only the air knew what had changed. 3 days later, Graverson returned with marshals who wore their duties like armor. "Gone," Grayson said, and the truth tasted like victory for an instant, and then like ash. Graverson's fury was a private weather. The law gave him no storm to use. The camp did not last the winter. Sanctuary, once revealed as Civ, cannot be trusted by those who need it. Grayson turned his energies to work that avoided ledgers and shunned light. He had learned that goodness should sometimes wear a mask if it meant goodness could live long enough to do anything at all. What became of the earlier vanished, the ones snatched before alarm learned to rouse the soldiers, no ledger can say. Some likely returned south in chains that felt unbearably familiar. Others were erased in the ways free cities learned to forget, their names washed by the East River and taken out to sea. History prefers neat closures. This kind of truth refuses them. And yet, hints survive like seeds carried in hems. In the spring of 1864, a church registry in St. Catharines, Ontario, noted the arrival of a group led by a woman who gave only an initial, P. An elder among them, who had suffered much, helped open a small school for the children of those whose footprints still smoked. He signed his name as Solomon. It is not proof. It is the sound of Hope's heel tapping under the table. The hamburger remains in the story like a bell. Long after the clubs and the warrants and the counterfeit seals, long after the ferry docks and the narrow alley where two men waited in the dark, that first bite survives because it was the opposite of everything that followed. It was permission to taste without fear. It was the way salt tightens the throat when grief has swollen it. It was a sacrament conducted with beef and bread and the radical premise that flavor belongs to everyone. The law changed on paper in 1864. Congress repealed the Fugitive Slave Act in the tidy language of statute. But statutes are scaffolds. Men still decide what to build. Northern businessmen who considered themselves clean discovered that rivers carry silt upstream too. The wealth that purchased pews and portraits did not come away from the washboard unreddened. Graverson's kind learned to bleach what was stained and to rename what could not be washed. Harold Grayson died with less money than he had earned and more knowledge than he could bear. He spent the remainder ahead of his death on work that left no plaque. Friedrich went home in 1867 to a Germany that had forgotten his accent. He told the story of the night of hamburgers to a cousin who did not quite understand why a grown man's voice would break over ground meat and a roll. The rope factory fell to a new century's hunger. The ground it covered left no sign that the earth had once absorbed so much fear and so much courage, often at the same table. We remember through fragments and refusals, a boarding house ledger that thins around a certain week. A letter without salutation found in a desk that shouldn't have survived a fire. A name in a registry, followed by a period that thuds like a heartbeat. And stories, told softly at kitchen tables where steam fogs the window, and a grandchild hears for the first time that goodness can make you cry as surely as cruelty. The true terror here is not the men with clubs. It is the elegance with which a structure persuades the decent to consider complicity a kind of prudence. It is the ordinary face of a clerk who stamps a document that will walk a man into a wagon. It is the way laws compose themselves to protect property without ever asking what a person is. If the horror were monstrous, we would be safe from it. The horror is domestic. It wears shoes like ours. So we hold fast to the image that saves. 23 people holding plates and then holding them closer, hands pleased by heat, mouths astonished by flavor, A circle of the formerly enslaved tasting care and answering with tears. Tears that baptized bread and beef, and the idea that everyone born deserves such astonishment as often as possible. If freedom were a taste, perhaps it would be this: salt and pepper on a patty seared just right, the softness of a roll, the knowledge that no one will take it out of your hands. And if freedom were a path, perhaps it would be this too: a road that does not end at the river, a door that opens when you knock after midnight, a ledger that records only first names, then loses itself on purpose, a baby named Hope raised by people who will tell her that patience is not passive, that it is a hand drawing back for the throw and a body leaning forward into the run. The past is not past. It sits at our tables and asks who cooked and for whom. It walks our streets and inquires what papers you would show if asked. It stands in line for a simple meal and wonders whether anyone will season it with recognition. It is a question that tastes like smoke and summer and the thickening of breath before a sob. What do we do now that we know?